Fans, welcome to Liberty Blue, the essential New York Rangers podcast. I'm Andrew Chelney. That's Nick Zararis. And Nick, for everybody's sake, I really hope that these finals are enjoyable because, oh my God, the conference finals were the farthest thing from enjoyable. And we are, by every definition of the word, the most obsessed, insanely, crazy hockey fans out there. And those finals were not fun. Conference finals were not fun.
You saw the talent gap. You saw the disparity between Dallas and Edmonton and Florida and Carolina. I think Florida, Carolina, I wouldn't say that's what at that exact permutation is what we expected, but we expected Florida to win that series relatively convincingly. Edmonton winning against Dallas was definitely a little surprising. Dallas's depth guys like Wyatt Johnston, Jason Robertson only had 2 goals in the series. A lot of guys in that lineup, and as talented as a group as Dallas is. I mean, Ottinger got outplayed by Stuart Skinner. Miro Heiskanen and Thomas Harley had hard times against Connor McDavid. Pete DeBoer has done that more than once, where he's thrown just guys under the bus, and like there's
Did it
nothing.
With Fleury, doing it with Ottinger.
There's not really anything to. There's no shame in losing to a team that's better than you. I don't think there was a whole lot Dallas could have done differently in that series to get a dramatically different result. The offense simply wasn't manifesting the way it needed to. It was putting too much pressure on the defense and the goaltending to be the difference. And as we've talked about, it is really hard to win with defense and goaltending in today's NHL, even as good as Dallas's defense, at least the left side is, and as good as Jake Ottinger is. But at the same time, as much as Pete wants to rag on Jake Ottinger, you didn't have to play Cody Ceci against McDavid by design. You didn't have to play Alex Petrovic as much as you did, but by virtue of the decisions Jim Nill made where they wanted to prioritize certain spending, they had to take more of a piecemeal approach to their defense, particularly that right side, which even at the deadline, we were looking at and saying they got to upgrade from Ceci, Dumba, and Lyubushkin because that just wasn't going to cut it once you got to a second or a third round. And I think Edmonton in particular deserves some credit for the way they've kind of piecemealed together a team. And obviously some of the pieces coming together are for non-hockey reasons. You know, you sign Evander Kane for $1 million 4 or 5 years ago because he got bought out because of the controversy with the Sharks. Corey Perry, same deal. John Klingberg dealing with long-term injuries coming off of double hip resurfacing surgery as a dart throw, basically. John Klingberg, I just mentioned. Jake Wallman was a really nice addition for them. He's fit very well there. Troy Stetcher, someone who, as a 7th D, would rotate in very well when he's played in these playoffs. Someone who, frankly...
Which, by the way, highlights that it's very important to have a 7th defenseman who can play hockey. Yeah. Like, it's very, this is... It shouldn't be breaking news. I'm not, curing any disease here. Like, this should be very easy to understand for everybody involved. Your 7th defenseman, your extra player that doesn't get in the lineup every night, should also be able to play hockey at a reasonably high level for them to be a 7th defenseman. Otherwise, they are not a 7th defenseman. I hope that clears anything up.
Troy Stetcher's overqualified to be a 7th defenseman. Like, I think Troy Stetcher on most teams cracks their top 6, but by virtue of Edmonton dealing with that long-term Ekholm injury, weren't sure when he was going to be back. They went out and added Wallman with the perception that if Ekholm doesn't come back, we think we can get by with Jake Wallman. Klingberg has been a revelation, frankly. If you watch the 8 to 10 regular season games he played for the Oilers, he was terrible. He looked like a guy who hadn't played hockey in a year and a half, and frankly, that's what he was. And he's been great since getting reinserted into the lineup in the LA series. But the big question is the same as always. How much do you trust that Edmonton defense and the goaltending in comparison to what you've seen from Florida for 3 straight years now? Where, I mean, that was a bullying against Carolina. Like, Florida was reveling in how much they were beating up Carolina, kind of in a real sicko, like, okay, you guys think you can forecheck and hit? We'll show you forechecking, and we'll show you how to actually play this style of hockey. And that's the thing, like, as much as people want to crap on Carolina for failing to break through, they play the exact same style as Florida. Florida's forecheck's a little more aggressive. Florida's got better players. There's nothing you can do if the other team is better than you at a certain point. You hit a wall and you can keep it close. You can inch around. I mean, game 5, Carolina had the lead and melted down the backstretch of the third period, but there's only so much you can do when there's a talent gap. I think on paper, I'm inclined to say Florida is a better team, 1 through 12 up front. I think defensively, the Oilers have gotten better results in the playoffs, even though Florida's defense is probably a smidge better on paper. Bob, obviously, better than Skinner. I think Paul Maurice and Knobloch are relatively close to each
Knobloch
other.
has been
Knobloch's
it's so great for Edmonton.
the thing I keep saying as far as Knobloch, and I think until he proves otherwise, he might just be the luckiest person to ever live, because every single button he's pressed for 2 straight playoffs has worked out and worked at a really high level. The fact he's successfully navigated Stuart Skinner meltdowns in consecutive playoffs, known when to pull him, known when to go back to him. And this year his hand was forced a little bit with Pickard getting hurt in the Vegas series, but when you have that intuitive of a feel of knowing what your guys need to be successful, I mean, they're missing a guy who had 70 goals last year between the regular season and playoffs in Zach Hyman. And most people are like, they'll figure it out. They'll be fine. And most teams can't overcome the loss of a first-line right wing. And yes, the Oilers have the benefit of having guys like Corey Perry with a ton of experience, Victor Arvidsson, who down regular season hasn't played every game in the playoffs, but has been a solid forechecker, someone, Kasperi Kapanen, they claimed off of waivers. They've put together a really unique group.
Cheeks Clappin', baby.
Cheeks
I mean, like, this is, which is, by the way, the most ridiculous nickname.
Best nickname in hockey.
Hockey has some ridiculous nicknames. Cheeks Clappin' might just be the most ridiculous one. But yeah, I mean, I want to throw a lot of flowers at Chris Knobloch. The way he, like you said, the way he's navigated the seemingly mountain of problems the Oilers have either had or seemingly have had, or something in between. And Chris has done a really great job of managing everything to a point where things just work, even with those issues in the background. Like, Stuart Skinner has been, I don't know what, like, is Dominic Hasek just wearing Skinner's equipment now? Is that what's going on? Like,
oh no, if you watch Stuart Skinner, he is still very much the same lumbering, awkward goalie who can't get post to post, but the puck's hitting him now, as opposed to in the King series.
He's been, Stuart Skinner is one of those goalies where if, like, the first shot goes in, a la like Tristan Jarry, it's going to be a long night. But if he feels the puck for like the first few minutes, it's going to be hell on earth to try to score on him. And Stuart, like, a lot of Skinner is confidence. Like, I've never seen a goaltender, or it's a very rare situation where literally the entire game will depend on how he's feeling. Like, if he is feeling it, if he's feeling like he can stop everything, he will stop everything. Or if he doesn't feel like he can, you'll have like 3 or 4 squeakers go in, and that's how the Oilers lose the game, and everybody's hammering down on Skinner again. Like, he is the most hot and cold goalie, but when he is hot, oh my, like, it's like, you try all you want to score on him, but it's not happening. Like, he's been on a roll. And yeah, again, like, Chris Knobloch deserves a lot of credit for all the buttons he's been pushing. And they're back in the, like, this is a rematch. It's such a difficult thing. But by the way, like, in all of sports, to have the same final again in 2025. Obviously, 50 years ago, it's a little bit of a different story. But
tell that to the Rangers 50 years ago, who couldn't get there for 20 years.
In 2025, with there being so much parity across all major sports leagues, for there to be a repeat of a cup final in the NHL, which has, by all intents and purposes, the most amount of parity in these finals, it's nothing short of incredible.
15 years, 2008, 2009, last time ballpark we've done this, when Pittsburgh, Detroit, before that had been the early 80s, the Islanders and the Oilers for the Stanley Cup final. And the last real thing on the final at large before we get in, and you alluded to it before, it's going to be a very long summer, and I really hope this series lives up to the hype, the potential. It's very rare, like you said, that we have the championship game final, I should say rematch, year after year. I think the Oilers and Panthers arguably are both playing better than they did in the playoffs last year. I think the Oilers in particular have played a bit more authoritatively, especially on the back end, where their defense has been worlds better than last year, where between Darnell Nurse playing extremely injured was terrible, Cody Ceci was in and out of the lineup, Vincent Desharnais, who was a healthy scratch for the Canucks at points this year, was someone who was in and out of the lineup as well. That got to the point where Chris Knobloch looked around and saw Philip Broberg, who had 82 NHL games to his name, and said, "You're going to play on the right with Darnell Nurse, and we're going to figure this out, or we're going to lose. But I would rather you play than Cody Ceci, so we'll figure it out." Which, again, crazy levels of intuitiveness to understand that, hey, I would rather try the guy who has no experience than keep losing with the guy who's getting us killed out there.
And it's something that we've been hammering since like day one of the show is like, why play old guys that you know are bad when you can at least see what young guys who might be bad have in the tank? Maybe they're actually good. Like it's such an obvious thing to do, and yet it baffles me that this happens, not just in hockey, but in other sports as well, where coaches will rely too much on veteran quote unquote leadership or, presence or whatever when they go out there and play, even though they're not having a great game, great game, great series, great year, whatever. They will continue to put them out there as opposed to, hey, this is a young guy who we don't know too much about, but he can't possibly be worse. So let's just see what he has. I like, again, and this is another tip to the cap to Chris, the fact that, Chris Knobloch wasn't afraid to do that. And again, he's a new coach in the NHL still. This isn't his first go around anymore, but relative to everybody else, for the most part, he's still a brand new face behind an NHL bench. So the fact that he wasn't scared to do that last year is really goes to show what his coaching mentality is, and it's something that I hope more coaches follow suit here as we move along.
I expect a very good series. I think these two teams are very evenly matched. The only thing that would really surprise me is if this were a 5 or a sweep. Other than that, I think 6 or 7 games, I think either team is capable of winning. I think the Oilers are probably a little bit better than they were last year. I think Florida's a little bit better than they were last year. I think Florida's depth in particular, that third line with Marchand and Luosterainen has been the best third line in these playoffs. I think the Oilers' biggest key will be how they survive the non-McDavid Draisaitl minutes. Last year, they lost him by 3 or 4 goals in the final, and they won the McDavid Draisaitl minutes by 4. That was ultimately the difference in the series. A series that came down to 1 goal in a game 7, a 2-1 in a series that Florida was up 3-0. Edmonton won 3 straight, forced the game 7 that came down to the final 10 minutes. So expecting and hoping for a good series, mostly because I don't want hockey to be over, because once the games dry up, it becomes a lot harder to be interesting. Frankly, there's only so many free agency profiles I can do about seventh defensemen. Like, as much as I like talking about guys like John Merrill and Jacob Middleton and Marcus Johansson for fourth line center roles, is Nick Bukestad still kicking? That's the type of guy that by the second week of July, there's a lot of Nick. Well,
you could do Marco Rossi. That the Wild want to trade him. So
he's 5'9" and European. Chris Drury doesn't even know Marco Rossi exists. I'm going to be honest with you. He's not even close to being on the Rangers' radar. But speaking of the Rangers, and I'm slowly watching everybody start to cope with the fact that realizing, oh, wait, Chris Drury can't really change the team all that much because everyone has no trade protection. I think it's fascinating that in the span of the month of May, the conversation went from they're going to get rid of everyone. They're going to get rid of Kreider, Zibanejad. They're going to trade K-Andre Miller and try and turn him into something else, to maybe they can turn Alexis Lafreniere and K-Andre Miller into Jacob Peterka and Bowen Byram, because, well, we can't get rid of Kreider or Zibanejad because of the no trade protection. And, well, Chris Kreider and Mike Sullivan have such a connection from USA Hockey, and the one season they overlapped with the Rangers in 2012. So it's been interesting to watch that unfold. It's
2025, by the way. I just want to put that out there.
Again, I saw the pictures of Mike Sullivan behind the Rangers bench in 2011. I just thought, damn, he had a really good head of hair, and it was all brown too. Now you could tell Mike Sullivan has been an NHL coach for 15 years now. His hairline's not terrible. It's definitely better amongst the guys in their 50s in the NHL, but you can tell he's been stressed out for a long time. Not quite aging like the president, but NHL coaches up there. I mean, NHL coaches have the shortest shelf life of the 4 major sports now. I was reading something about that in The Athletic. I think it was last week after the Ducks had hired Joel Quenneville, that NHL coaches get like 2.5 seasons, and after that, you're out of luck, which I think is interesting because arguably hockey coaches have the least direct impact of the four major sports on a game-to-game basis. Like, yes, there are some NBA coaches who are just aura farming and yelling when they're on the bench. They're not drawing things up on the clipboard. You know, I think about that clip of Darvin Ham just holding an empty clipboard with nothing diagrammed on it, or that clip I saw of Jeff Teague saying, Tibbs doesn't coach. He just says, play harder, do a better job. And it's hilarious, but at the same time, basketball, you know, one star player can do a whole lot.
Tibbs does do a lot more than that, but like, by the way.
Well, of course, it's hyperbole.
Yeah.
Jeff Teague's a great storyteller, that's part of the shtick.
He's very entertaining to listen to. Even if like Jeff, like let's reel it back in reality just a little bit. That would be that would be better for the story. I would.
The 1 year Thibs wasn't coaching between Minnesota and here, he learned how to coach a little bit better. Maybe it's possible. But the main reason I bring that up is I wanted to try and apply the logic of what Mike Sullivan was doing in Pittsburgh to the Rangers. And I think the big problems, and I think most people are aware of this, but over the last 2-3 years in particular, as the Pittsburgh group aged out, the big problem and the reason Mike Sullivan's system kind of started to falter there is the Penguins lost their foot speed. You know, that Penguins team that won back-to-back cups, you're talking about a Carl Hagelin, you're talking about Phil Kessel, you're talking about Sid with 8 less years of miles on his legs, you're talking about Malkin with 8 less years of miles on his legs, guys like Nick Bonino, who once upon a time could skate and weren't just corpses like he was on the Rangers. And that's a real issue because as we've talked about for the entire duration of this show, the Rangers are not a fast hockey team. They can play fast, but they are not fast in a straight line. They don't have great foot speed, and that has continuously been an issue when they've gotten to playing the Floridas and the Tampa Bays of the world. And the first real part of the conversation for the how does Mike Sullivan apply to what he's going to do with the Rangers, what he did in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was when they were winning the Cups, they were arguably the best forechecking team in the league. I think you see a strong correlation with regular season and playoff success with being an effective forechecking team. We consistently
and that's how Florida plays as well, by the way.
Florida's more aggressive than Pittsburgh. Florida is sending basically 2 guys at the puck most of the time, as opposed to Pittsburgh, which was just a really aggressive 1-2-2. But the big problem, and one of the things that I was putting together in my notes for this show, is that not only do the Rangers not have great foot speed, which becomes an issue for that first forechecker in trying to create pressure, they don't have great attention to detail in the neutral zone, which is really where this works to a T, and what made Pittsburgh so successful when they were winning those Stanley Cups was they played great neutral zone defense. And last year, the Rangers were one of the worst transition teams in the entire NHL. And the Penguins were the worst defensive transition team in the entire NHL. The Penguins gave up the most scoring chances off of the rush in the entire NHL last year. And yes, some of that is you're featuring Chris Letang and Erik Karlsson, 2 offense-first defensemen who aren't particularly inclined to care all that much about defense. But at the same time, does anyone feel good about any of the Rangers defensemen under contract as far as transition play goes? And look, he's not bringing David Quinn with him to coach the defense, which that's a major win on multiple levels. And that's probably part of why the Penguins were so bad off the rush. I mean, we all recall how bad the Rangers were defensively off the rush with David Quinn as their head coach. I think that hiring probably will be made a bigger deal than it actually is. But I think mechanically, a lot of what Mike Sullivan wants to do isn't really going to be applicable because the Rangers just don't have the personnel to do it. And I think, I talked about this with Hunter Hodes, I've talked about this with Jesse Marshall. That was some of the undoing here in Pittsburgh over the last 3 years or so, was that Mike Sullivan was kind of refusing to accept he didn't have the guys to run what he wanted to run anymore. And over time, that just started to erode. You know, when you're constantly pinching up in the offensive zone to get that extra forechecker because you're trying to sustain pressure, yeah, you're going to get killed off the rush, especially when it's guys like Erik Karlsson, Letang, Ryan Graves, who's one of the worst free agent signings of the cap era. I mean, it's a really hard transition to make. Obviously, the Rangers, different personnel. Mike Sullivan has to get a feel for what his guys can do. But at the same time, you know, it's really not hard to see this being basically a sadder version of Pittsburgh 2.0, Pittsburgh post 2020 2.0, if you want to take the doomerist view.
I think one of the maybe glass half full thoughts for this is, again, I would imagine because Mike Sullivan and Chris Drury have an already well established, clearly, relationship, that Mike would at least have some kind of input as to how he envisions the roster to look like. It might not be with exact names. Like he might not, have the, oh, we have to get X, Y, and Z player for this system to work or else it'll collapse. I don't know if that will, like, he might have suggestions, but I don't think Drury will let Mike Sullivan
Where are they
take
going
the
to
reins
play
on that.
though? That's the problem. They like we
Right,
talked
but
about for an hour last week. They've got 16
right,
forwards for 12
yeah,
spots.
which goes back to the thought process that the Rangers will be pretty aggressive, I think, at the draft to try to clear out some of these guys, because the guys that are in the locker room right now, most of them cannot play the system that Mike Sullivan wants them to play. So the idea comes from, okay, well, you're going to bring in Mike Sullivan, and I would have to imagine there were multiple conversations prior to Mike Sullivan saying yes to the job, that, okay, we're going to play the system that I want us to play, but it's going to involve more foot speed, more aggression, more attention to detail, something that the Rangers did not employ much of at all this past season. And if you want to drastically change the way a team plays in a very short amount of time, okay, well, there's pretty much only one option. That's to change at least some of the personnel that you want to play in that system. If I don't want to name like specific players right now, but like, if players X, Y, and Z on the Rangers right now forwards aren't the fastest and cannot get to the aggressive forward checking style that Mike Sullivan wants, well, then they don't have room to play on this team anyway. So they're going to get moved out. And whether that happens now or maybe in December or whatever, I don't think this is going to be an overnight turnaround for this team, but I would have to imagine, with all, with everything that comes with hiring Mike Sullivan as your head coach, to what I would imagine is a long-term deal. That's why you paid him so much money to be here, that the roster turnaround eventually is going to look a lot more like the 2009 Penguins than the 2024 Rangers.
I think there's a lot to unpack because that's something that's been made a real point of contention. Gallant and both Laviolette have both been kind of thrown under the bus for Drury's not executing Drury's vision. I think a lot of our frustration with the Rangers at large, especially when it comes to how they lost to the Devils, how they lost to Florida, was an unwillingness to try different things, and how much of that is, well, the GM wants the roster set up this way and the coach wants to run it this way. How can we best apply what we have? And I do think there are some things the Rangers can make work as far as what Mike Sullivan has traditionally done. But I don't think, as we sit here right now, and I'm going to pull up my notebook in a second here and hold it up to the camera in a very blurry manner, which it'll be better on the actual polished, published YouTube version later today. But a lot of what made the Penguins successful when they were winning Stanley Cups was also the fact that they had really good teams. Like, I don't want to point out the obvious here, but to win 2 consecutive Stanley Cups, you got to have really good hockey teams. And as good a player as Artemi Panarin is, he's not Sidney Crosby. The Rangers do not have a Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin caliber of 1-2 centers. And as much as you want to say, well, they're going to get a little bit more out of a Will Cooley and Brennan Othman and maybe Gabriel Perreault, trying to translate other successes to the Rangers has largely been their biggest issue. Is they go and get guys without a whole lot of idea as to how to get them to be successful here. It's, okay, Barclay Goodrow won 2 Stanley Cups. Let's bring him here. He'll help us win. Well, what made him successful in Tampa Bay? What was his toolbox, and what did they ask him to do? You could say the same thing as far as Vincent Trocheck, who did have a good year 2 years ago, last year. Very different what the expectations were for him in Carolina as the third-line center versus the second-line center with the Rangers. I think a lot of the defensemen they've rotated in over the years on the back end, especially guys like a Nico Mikkola, who they saw something in, didn't know how to use it, Florida said, okay, depressed asset, we can get something out of you. We know what we can do with this. And you see, Mikkel has been great for them in these playoffs the last 2 years, frankly. And the Rangers have a lot of questions, and trying to apply the concepts of Mike Sullivan to this group, I see where it can work, but at the same time, we also know that there is further change coming. And that's
Oh
really
yeah, 100%.
that's really kind of the fine line to walk here, and it's why this summer is probably the sliding doors moment. And the Rangers have a lot of work to do to execute whatever Mike Sullivan's vision for this team is. And I know we've been supposing that the reason they didn't fire Laviolette in season was they had an inclination that Mike Sullivan might ultimately be available, and they didn't want to run the risk of hiring someone in season to be the full-time coach, or screwing someone over they liked as the interim to kind of not be able to get the full-time job. But man, it's really hard to see a world where just changing the coach is going to do a whole lot. And we'll start talking more specifics in a second, but I know we've been hammering this point for a month now. And frankly, go back and watch the episode the day of free agency after they lost to the Devils. Go watch it the day after they lost to Florida. A coach can only change so much. Hockey coaches have very little direct game management impact in comparison to the other sports.
Unless your name is Chris Knobloch, in which case you are the...
Well, that's picking the lineup. That's not so much like the game itself,
right?
Like pushing the buttons, etc. Because baseball, you got to manage the pitchers, pinch hitters. You got the game situation.
I would agree. I think the one thing I'll push back on you a little bit is we did glaze Knobloch, even earlier this episode about how well, like the day-to-day stuff is, the head coach doesn't really have too much say about it, but if Chris Knobloch isn't coaching the Oilers, you think like whoever would have been could have gotten the same kind of, elevation out of Stuart Skinner? Like, I don't know the answer to that. The answer is probably no. Like, Chris Knobloch has done such a good job of being a manager of the roster that he doesn't necessarily, he has done such a good job of that it kind of does those little things do matter. Whereas with, if it was anybody else or most other coaches, I don't know if you would have gotten that same result. So I think Chris is I like that little bit extra that he's been doing on a day-to-day has pushed the Oilers to a level above.
Well, we're talking about different things. You're talking about lineup construction. I'm talking about like within the flow of the game, like getting better results within a given game. That's what I'm talking. We're talking about different things. Yeah, because like a baseball manager is more direct. You got to take your pitcher out when they're less effective. Pinch hitter if you have a favorable matchup. Even basketball, knowing when to use your timeouts, knowing when to use your reviews. Football, it's a lot more straightforward. Football is just straight up chess. If one team's running the ball really well, put an extra linebacker in there to try and slow them down. The inverse, you're getting killed over the top, get an extra defensive back in there. Hockey, we always talk about it's play the system better, not adjust. And that was Gerard Gallant's undoing, was the refusal to adjust, especially in that Devils series. I think you can make an argument it was Laviolette's undoing to some degree in the Florida series where they were getting killed in transition, and we couldn't insert Zach Jones for Jacob Trouba, but we also couldn't execute a breakout pass. So it created a real conundrum that wasn't solved and ultimately was their undoing a year later. And before I pull up the notebook, the last point I wanted to make before we actually start getting into some specifics, the one area I do think Mike Sullivan will have a real positive impact on is just going from a man-to-man defense that they ran under Laviolette to going to more of a box-and-one zone, because you saw it last year. The Rangers defense was a joke, especially in their own zone, where guys would get beat and they would look at each other like, oh, was that your guy or is that my guy? And it creates that kind of, well, if they're not playing well, do I really have to try that hard? And that's what killed them last year, was a whole lot of guys just standing around, sulking shoulders, doing the, well, I messed up and he messed up. And then, Laviolette saying, I'm not going to answer any systems questions. Well, Pete, I don't know if you know any of the questions we're going to ask because you haven't adjusted a damn thing all year. And it creates that kind of sense of, well, if the coach isn't going to try to make things better.
That's also what he did the last month of the season.
Yeah.
To which then he promptly got removed from his job. So
Yeah. And look, I did want to say this real quick before I throw it back to you. Someone left a comment on the video last week saying, so the Rangers should have focused on next year instead of trying to make the playoffs. That wasn't the main point. The point was the returns and the likelihood. Would you bet your life on winning the Powerball tomorrow? Probably not. You probably wouldn't go and do that. Would you bet $5 on a 50-50 coin toss? Yeah, sure. Why not? That's the kind of way you need to think about this. With 10 games to go, they were 8-9 points back. They had like a 5 to 10% chance of making the playoffs at that point. Was it more likely that they were going to make the playoffs or miss the playoffs? And that's how you need to govern your decisions. That's how you need to make your decisions. It's not one or the other. It's based on how things are playing out. We are more likely to do this. Based on that, it's more prudent to do this. That's just responsible planning.
Yeah, and we talked about this last week, where if you got like 5, 6, 7 games after the season, and the season's pretty much over, it's almost like it goes back to David Quinn playing Colin Blackwell over Lafreniere. It's like at a certain point, dog, you just throw up the best up and coming players you got and just see what they have, because you at a certain point you don't have anything more to lose. You're already at the poker table and you've already lost all of your money. Like, you are done. Peter, like, Laviolette knew he was done. Everybody in the locker room knew, like, this is it. So at that point, you might as well just be like, all right, well, Berard, go play 20 minutes on the first line. See what we got. Why are you playing Colin Blackwell in a lost season over first overall pick Alexis Lafreniere? Why is that happening? Like, to a lesser, much lesser extent, that was what was going on the last couple weeks of the season. The Rangers were not making the playoffs, and yet their roster construction was geared towards, okay, we're gonna put Parson in and whomstever else above Berard, and we're gonna sit Gabriel Perreault for reasons, and
he's got to watch the game with the coaches,
right? The coaches that are not even here anymore. So, like, that's what we were talking about. Like, you have to assess the situation and be like, okay, this team is not making the playoffs, so at least let's try just seeing what these guys have, because you already know what everybody else has. You might as well just try something else.
And that's what we get back to, the idea of, like, the coach and the GM aren't always going to have the best interests, the alignment of best interests with their same team. It creates a real conundrum of, like, do I make the ethical decision and do what's best for the team, or do I look out for myself? And obviously most of the time the GM and the coach, they look out for themselves. You go back to the Art Howe quote in Moneyball. Well, I got to explain the decisions I'm making right now when I'm on the job circuit next year. And that's how a lot of these guys operate. So pivoting, I'm going to grab my notebook here and try not to bump the camera while I do that. But the main thing,
real sicko behavior out of Nick right
now.
No,
it's not. I was trying to organize my notes for today's show because I knew I wasn't going to have a lot of time in the morning to do it before I started work. So the big thing here, when you're understanding this and relatively organized, my handwriting's gotten better in my 20s, which I'll give myself credit for. But the big thing here when we're talking about Mike Sullivan hockey is the bomb forechecker, and this alignment is opposite. If the puck is on the left side, this unmarked guy would be over here because the defense would be shading that way. But the big thing in understanding Mike Sullivan forecheck is that first guy has to be on. And we know the Rangers are not a great forechecking team in that respect, where that first guy in doesn't always follow up. They're not, because they don't have great foot speed, they're not able to get in the lane. But the idea in principle here is the F1 is trying to get this pass to come here, because then it's boxed out. Because you have two defenders closing out this lane, that forces the only pass this defenseman to have to be cross ice, to be down here. It creates a real simple chess match of puck goes here, I go here. Of course, we've talked about this a ton. This is where attention to detail matters, where if the puck goes one place, you need to be in the other. We know the Rangers were not great at that last year. You saw it year over year. The 1-3-1 worked great that first year Laviolette was here for the middle chunk of the season when they really started to round into form. And then last year, the 1-3-1, the thing about it is it's supposed to mitigate a lack of foot speed, and the Rangers tried to get faster on the back end. Borgen is a better skater than Jacob Trouba. Borgen's best trait is he's a good skating defenseman. He's not great at handling the puck, even though he shoots a lot, but he's good at getting where he needs to be. Keandre Miller is very mobile when he wants to be in the right place at the right time. Vakanainen, probably a little bit faster than some of the other guys they've auditioned back there. Zach Jones, we know, is a very strong skater. All of that is to say, the coach set up the 1-3-1 with the mindset of, I know my guys are not fast enough. That middle layer, that 3, has to break the game up. It has to slow it down. And instead, it got gouged last year. The Rangers were atrocious in transition. They gave up some of the highest rates of high danger chances against of any team in the entire NHL because they were getting killed in transition. And so much of the Rangers' success next year is going to be tied to, can they execute this forecheck successfully? Because if not, it'll be what happened in Pittsburgh the last 2 years, where they got brutalized in transition because those guys are coming up, because these guys are coming up down here. Wait, no, this side. Because these guys are crashing down here, it puts these 2 guys on islands. With those 2 guys on islands, usually it's going to be 3-on-2. And we saw that happen a lot, actually, funny enough, in that Rangers Penguins series 3 years ago, in that first round series, where the Rangers were keep dropping those 2 guys, and they would constantly have 3 coming at them. And they would lose that numbers advantage through the first 3 games of that series, and it ultimately undid them. The other thing I wanted to touch on as far as like systems and how it works, the big problem for the Rangers defense in the playoffs historically has been transition. It's been, can we go from defense to offense? And that's something the Oilers basically overhauled their entire defense to implement, excuse me. You know, Klingberg and Wallman as replacements for CC and Desharnais, night and day. Darnell Nurse playing 2-3 minutes less per game at 5-on-5, more an emphasis on penalty kill, is getting better results out of him. And you think about it from the Rangers perspective. So the reason the Penguins really struggled in transition the last year or two is this is hard to execute. So the puck's down low and you got to get it to one of F1 or F2. The reason this is hard is because the other team is going to be bearing down on those 2 forwards. So one of these 2 guys has to receive this puck and then try and get it to the middle to go to transition, or one of these 2 guys has a clear lane. With that in mind, you think about how much the Rangers have struggled just to execute that first pass, let alone you're going to ask a guy with someone bearing down on him to get a second pass to get out of the zone. So I think there's potential here, obviously, to get better results out of guys that had rough years last year. But at the same time, I don't necessarily see the smoothest fit for systems versus the skill sets they do have. And I do think that's been an issue, that the Rangers don't really have guys that play the way the coaches want. I think you've pretty consistently heard, dating back to David Quinn, the coaches complain that they don't play north-south enough, they don't forecheck hard enough. And instead of replacing, the guys who don't forecheck, they've changed the coach. And look, that's not to absolve David Quinn, Gerard Gallant, Peter Laviolette of their faults. They all had them to varying degrees. But at a certain point, spade's a spade. You can try to make the horse drink from the river, but you can't make them. You can bring them there. You can say, hey, man, you look thirsty, but you got to actually drink that water.
Well, the thing, too, is, again, and this goes back to my hypothesis that the Rangers will be aggressive here at the draft, is I also think they're gonna target, maybe via trade, maybe via free agency, some former Penguin that played well under this system. I think to what degree, of talent / skill that they have is, obviously I have no idea, but I do think that they will try to bring in somebody that Mike Sullivan trusts within his system specifically, and also not just to play in the system, but to also teach everybody else as well. Be like, hey, I played in this system. This is what worked well within the system when I played, and here's how to do it. I think that is another layer to all of this, where I just think it's different now with Mike Sullivan, because, again, we talked about this before. Chris Drury has wanted Mike Sullivan to coach this team since day one of him being here. And Mike Sullivan has said no multiple times. And then Drury has said, okay, well, all right, we'll go get David Quinn. All right, we'll go get, Gerard Gallant. Well, all right, we'll go get Peter Laviolette because Mike Sullivan's not available. Now Mike Sullivan is available, and now he's a Ranger. So now I think with his top guy being here, his system, his ideas, etc., we are going to get more change than we had before. I genuinely do believe. I'm not reporting that. I don't have hashtag sources. I'm not going to claim to be an insider right now. But from all of the context clues, reading all of the tea leaves, it really does at least show me a little bit here inside the meeting, the behind closed doors of, okay, Drury finally has his man. He knows he has one season to change the Rangers, otherwise Drury's out the door. I'm like, this is not a secret or anything. So okay, I'm gonna bring in the guy that I've wanted to head coach since I've been, since day one of me being here, whether that be assistant GM or not. And we are going to get people in the door that are going to fit the system as best as we possibly can, because you cannot run it back the same way that you did this year. You can't, because if you do and you miss the playoffs, you're out of a job. Drury knows
Is he
that.
though? Is he though?
If the Rangers do not make the playoffs, it is. I mean, I can't say 100% for certain, obviously, but like, he's very likely not going to be here the year after if the Rangers flame out again.
The one last thing I wanted to ask you about, because I was trying to surmise like who fits the bill. The one person I in my cursory looking, and like I have no idea if he was even 53 points in 73 games isn't bad last year. The only guy that comes to mind is Jason Zucker, but he was also bad in Pittsburgh, so I don't think he's an exact fit. I was rattling my brain of like former Penguins who are still in the NHL and not like just useless, but it's a short list. The Penguins haven't had a great team the last few years, and like Chad Ruhwedel coming back to teach everyone else the defense, because that's the only defenseman I could think of that's still kicking.
He could be one of the assistant coaches, unironically. Like the Rangers might genuinely hire him to maybe run the defense. I don't know.
The last thing I wanted to hit on before we get out of here, with so much still to come, the draft will be interesting more so from what they don't do than what they do. If they trade the first pick it's not even on the floor because it's not an in-person draft anymore. But if they trade that pick, I think that tells you a lot. I think if they use that pick, that tells you a lot.
Yeah, they should trade this pick.
You would think they are going to trade this pick to try and level up some of their assets. We did the hypothetical, the trade machine idea of what you would do, how you would try and upgrade some of the pieces you do have. I think that pick is essential to any type of upgrade move. I will say real quick, Bowen Byram is not that dissimilar from K'Andre Miller and like where he's at in his trajectory as a player. I don't think Bowen Byram like really changes all of that much from Miller. I think my biggest goal or objective this offseason is, if I'm the Rangers, is to try and get someone in that Lafreniere age range of like 23, 24, needs a change of scenery, but has good draft pedigree and has shown flashes at the NHL level. We joked about Marco Rossi being European, so he's and 5'9", so he's probably out. NHL GMs have a lot in common with the women of Hinge. If you're
unironically, if there was ever a time the Rangers would trade for somebody like that, it'd be right now, because Mike Sullivan knows what to do with those players.
In theory, again, theory can only take you so far.
Sure.
There's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, he's not 6 feet tall, so then nobody's going to swipe right on him.
That's the real conundrum you have as an NHL player. Look at Braden Point. Braden Point was 5'10", and he couldn't skate well, and they were like, third round pick, second round pick, even though, one of the best 2-year playoff windows of anybody of the 21st century. You can make guys better when they're young and moldable. When they're 30, you ain't getting them to change a damn thing about their games. It's one of those real conundrums that Mike Sullivan's going to have here. Like, how does he build a rapport with these guys to get them to buy in? And how is that any different from, Peter Laviolette doing family dinners and family days at practice and doing whatever he can to get guys to care? And like, obviously they care, but like, showing they care. The attention to detail, the transition.
Don't tell me you care. Show me on the ice that you care.
Yeah, man, it's the significant other who says they're going to get their act together, but you come home and it's 11 o'clock and they're watching The Price is Right with chips on their chest. At a certain point, man, you're just a bum who's watching The Price is Right, not job hunting. There is a difference. You can do things to materially change your circumstance within reason, of course, within reason. Sure. But until the Rangers start moving things, it's going to be a lot of talking in circles, Andrew. There's not a whole lot to glean from the radio silence this time of year. Maybe we'll talk about who the Rangers color analyst will be next year, because that's to be determined still. Shout out Joe Micheletti, Hall of Fame wingman, letting your boy ride into the sunset, not saying a word and saying, you know what? I'm with him. I'm out. The Irish goodbye from professional life is great. Just not saying a word until it's well after the fact. Getting the text, what happened to you last night? Oh, I went home. I ordered Taco Bell. I went home.
And I just want to highlight this from Victor Fowler quickly, who posted this comment on our YouTube. He's like, let's keep in mind, if the same team comes back, I don't care who the coach is, it's not going to work. Yeah, I mean, for the most part, that's what we've been saying, right? And that's
in theory.
Right. And
because they did do that 2 years ago, where like the big changes were Eric Gustafsson and Blake Wheeler, and then they had the best season in the history of the team.
Well, except for, but at the end of the day, like, it's true in that, you bring in
narrative-wise, it's true.
Narrative-wise, it's true. You bring in a guy to coach your team with a vastly different mindset as opposed to the rest of, the coaches that you hired because you couldn't get your top guy. And I would have to think that the roster just isn't going to stay the same because of how demanding Mike Sullivan's system is. This is not a 1-3-1 where the system relies on, okay, well, the players aren't the best of skaters, so this is kind of a shield to protect them from that. Whereas Mike Sullivan's system doesn't have a shield. It's, okay, well, you're playing this system or you are going to look like you've never played hockey before. And
the Rangers are good at that, looking like they've never played hockey before.
Rangers really did a great job of doing that to themselves last season. So I think if there's no buy-in from some of the players on this team, that they will not be here come training camp. I think running it back again with the same personnel, expecting more demanding results and more attention to detail after what we saw last season, I think is unattainable, and I think change will come as a result.
Gotta hope. Otherwise, next year is going to feel like a waste of time, much like last year did.
Right. And we were talking about it every week. Every single week we came on the show, we talked about how things need to change, and nothing changed, and look where we are. Yeah. I hate to play the,
we are
I told you so card, but we have been knocking on this door, breaking it down the entire season. And that's how we got here.
And real quick, I have to say this for the umpteenth time. They added a point per game forward to this team in the middle of the season. They subtracted nothing from their lineup on a game-to-game basis. And they had a worse record and a worse power play conversion rate with JT Miller on the team. Do not tell me, but they added a point per game player, someone who is in the consensus top 30 to 40 players in the entire NHL. They were a under 500 hockey team with said point per game player on the team,
who played well after he got here.
He played well after he got here, and the team's defense got worse. You cannot change this with just one or two or even three. This is a wholesale, like, we're changing a fourth to a third of this team level of improvement needed if you want to actually get better results. Because I keep sitting here and looking at the defensive group going into the season and thinking, good God, this is going to suck. This is just going to be miserable because it is so uninspiring. I made the joke, the turbo dog shit. That's all this defense is. Former first round picks who had great amateur track records, who have got loads of potential. Well, if he's got potential, how come he hasn't shown any? Yeah. Well, if he can hit good, how come he hasn't hit good? At a certain point,
the great tweet that's like, if the evaluation starts with former first overall pick, that they're just not good at playing the sport.
Again, you got cast-offs from the Ducks, Kraken, and Sharks, and I'm supposed to be excited? Like, oh, wow, guys that weren't good enough for bad teams are on our team now? That's so great. I mean, come on, man. Come on.
Yeah.
All right.
I would agree.
That'll do it for this week's edition of Liberty Blue. If you could be so kind, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you're on Apple or Spotify, please take that extra second, leave a 5-star review. If you're over on YouTube, like the video, subscribe to the channel, get notifications whenever new content goes out. Home stretch until 2 weeks of chaos and then absolutely nothing for 2 months.